The windshield wipers of the LMTV beat their steady rhythm against the glass, and the transport route back to Fort Bragg, North Carolina, was exactly what it was supposed to be at 2 in the morning. Empty, quiet, and proceeding according to procedure. Then the headlights swept across the shoulder of Route 24 and found the overturned civilian SUV half submerged in the black water of a flooded roadside ditch, and a man standing in the driving rain with both arms raised over his head and his face carrying the specific expression of someone who has run out of options and knows it. My name is Cole Marcus. I am 33 years old, a first lieutenant in the United States Army, Tactical Transport Division, Fort Bragg, North Carolina. I have spent 11 years behind the wheel of vehicles that weigh more than most people's houses and moved cargo through routes that the Army has mapped, scheduled, and regulated to the minute. I know the operations manual. I can recite Rule 4, the prohibition against unauthorized stops, from memory. I can also read the face of a father standing in a flood at 2 in the morning. The notebook with Rule 4 was on the passenger seat. I looked at it. I looked at the man in the rain. I looked at the ditch where the SUV was sinking. And through the rear window, I could see the pale shape of a woman curled around something small and motionless. My hands gripped the steering wheel hard enough to turn my knuckles white. My career was 12 years of clean service record, 2 commendations, and exactly 3 years from a full pension. All of it was in that notebook on the passenger seat, stacked against the image of a woman wrapped around a blue-lipped infant in 3 feet of rising floodwater. The decision did not take long. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Hit that like if you've ever had 3 seconds to make a choice you knew was going to cost you something real. Back to Cole. I slammed the brakes. The 5-ton truck skidded on the soaked asphalt and came to a stop at the shoulder's edge. I hit the hazard lights, amber pulsing weakly against the wall of North Carolina rain, and kicked the door open and jumped down into the dark. The mud of the roadside ditch swallowed my boots to the ankle immediately, a cold, wet grip that rose past my ankles with every step. The water was already at the man's waist. He was hitting the rear window with a bloody elbow, his movements jagged and wild, the specific movements of someone whose body has been fighting cold water long enough that coordination is becoming a question. I did not think about Rule 4 anymore, standing waist-deep in the floodwater with the current pulling at my legs like invisible hands. The operations manual had become as abstract as anything I had ever read. There was only the woman inside the vehicle, the shape she was protecting, and a child's cry coming from somewhere beneath the roar of the rain, thin, high, and getting weaker. I ripped the crowbar from the side utility mount of the truck. One swing, the rear safety glass shattered. The sound mixed with the high-pitched cry of the infant and the hiss of the flood and the crack of thunder rolling over the Carolina foothills. The woman inside was pale and past shock, her body curled around a baby girl whose lips had gone the specific blue of hypothermia. I worked the heavy steel tow chains onto the SUV's undercarriage frame, with hands that were already losing feeling at the fingertips, then scrambled back up into the LMTV's cab and threw it into low gear. The massive tires spun in the mud for a heart-stopping second before they caught asphalt, and the chain pulled taut, and the overturned vehicle slid out of the ditch and onto the shoulder like something being retrieved from a grave. We could not go to the base. The military police at Fort Bragg's gate would have detained us before the family had a chance to dry off. I drove 15 miles off my logged route and found a Motel 6 with a vacancy sign blinking through the rain, and I helped them check in and waited in the doorway until the baby had stopped shivering and the woman's color had returned, and the man had wrapped himself in a motel towel and stopped shaking enough to speak. He looked at the name tag on my soaked uniform. He looked at it the way people look at something they intend to memorize. He said I had saved his whole world. His voice broke on the last word. I told him his only mission now was to keep that baby warm. The walk back to the truck was the longest mile I had walked all year. I sat in the cab for a long time, with my hands shaking on the steering wheel, not from cold, though I was soaked through to my base layer, but from the specific adrenaline crash that arrives after the emergency has resolved and the body understands it is no longer needed in that register. The dashboard clock read 0430. I was 2 hours behind schedule. The Blue Force tracker had logged every second of the stop, every foot of the detour, every minute of unauthorized deviation. It was all there in the system, permanent and irrefutable. I knew exactly what was waiting for me at Fort Bragg. I put the truck in gear and drove toward it. At 0600, the fist on the door of my transient quarters was not a wake-up call. I had not slept. I was still in my uniform, still carrying the red North Carolina clay on my boots and jacket, still wearing the evidence of the roadside ditch on my skin. 2 military police officers stood in the hallway with faces that communicated nothing except that my presence was required immediately, and I walked between them across the base in the early morning light, with the mud squelching in my boots and the weight of what I had done settling into something that felt permanent in my chest. Colonel Hardin's office was climate-controlled to 68 degrees and smelled of expensive coffee from a machine that had no business being in a military building. His mahogany desk was immaculate. His carpet was pale beige. I was led to just inside the door and left standing at the position of attention while he reviewed a file without acknowledging my presence. 15 minutes passed. I watched a drop of muddy water fall from the hem of my jacket onto his carpet. Once, then again, a small brown stain spreading on the pale beige. I understood that he was letting it happen. The stain was part of the communication. When Hardin finally removed his reading glasses and looked at me, his eyes carried the specific vacancy of a man who has decided that human feeling is an inefficiency in his function. He walked me through what I had done with the methodical patience of someone laying out evidence. The unauthorized stop, the deviation from route, the risk to sensitive military cargo, the 2-hour delay to the depot. His voice was quiet and sharp in the way that instruments are quiet and sharp. Then he stood up from behind the desk and began to circle me, slowly, deliberately, stopping near my ear to tell me that men who allowed sentiment to override training had no place in tactical transport, that my decision had been exactly the predictable result of weak judgment, that I had made the flag on my shoulder look shabby with my incompetence. I pressed my nails into my palms behind my back until I felt skin give. He returned to the desk and produced a single document. The header read, General Officer Memorandum of Reprimand. In the Army, this document is a career death sentence. It lives in the permanent file. It announces failure to every promotion board that will ever review a soldier's record. Hardin picked up a silver pen and tossed it at me, rather than handing it. It hit my chest and clattered to the floor, landing directly in the muddy puddle that had been accumulating around my boots throughout the meeting. He told me that, effective the next morning, I would report to basement-level warehouse C for inventory duty, cleaning supplies and medical consumables that needed counting. He told me to stay out of his sight until he decided whether to process my discharge entirely. I bent down and picked the pen up out of the muddy water. I placed the reprimand paper on the corner of his desk and signed my name with a hand shaking badly enough to make the signature look like something torn. Hardin did not look up. He had already moved on to the next file in front of him, erasing me with the efficiency of a man who processes these things often enough to have made peace with the process. Warehouse C was 3 stories underground and smelled of cardboard and damp cement and the specific flatness of recycled air that has never seen a window. For 11 years, my hands had handled steering wheels the size of small tables, feeling diesel power vibrate through the frame of 5-ton vehicles. Now I held a plastic barcode scanner that cost $20 at any office supply store. Beep, 200 pairs of wool socks. Beep, 300 rolls of toilet paper. The fluorescent lights above me flickered at irregular intervals, adding their own rhythm to the silence. Hardin understood exactly what he was doing. The basement was not punishment for a specific infraction. It was an environment engineered to wear a person down through meaninglessness, to make the silence so complete and the work so far beneath a soldier's training that they would eventually sign their own discharge papers just to escape it. He had put me here not to correct me, but to break me quietly. By noon, I could not manage another hour underground. I clocked out and went up to the mess hall. The room went quiet the moment I stepped into the serving line. Not the full silence of a major announcement, but the specific, dropped volume hush of a room that has registered a cautionary example has walked in. I kept my eyes on my tray and loaded food. I had no intention of eating and found a table at the back corner near the exit. Lieutenant Doyle intercepted me before I reached it. Doyle was the kind of officer whose boots were always polished and whose platoon was never as sharp as his uniform implied, and he worked best with an audience, which he had. He shouldered into me hard enough to tilt the tray, announced my superhero ambitions to the room at considerable volume, mentioned the taxpayer's dime, and enjoyed the laughter that rippled across the tables while I lowered my head and walked to the corner and sat down and chewed food that tasted like nothing for 15 minutes before I gave up and carried the tray to the return window. I found a payphone near the kitchen exterior, an outdated piece of hardware that nobody used anymore, which made it private. I called my mother in the foothills of western North Carolina. Her voice came through warm and accented, and carrying the specific relief of a woman who had spent a week watching storm coverage on local television and praying. I told her I'd been reassigned to an administrative role. I told her it was safer than the convoys. I heard her exhale the breath she had been holding for months. I hung up and slid down the concrete wall and sat on the floor with my back against the building in the cold air. The lie tasted like ash. It was worse than the reprimand. It was worse than Doyle's shoulder. I was protecting her peace by surrendering my own truth. A hand appeared in front of my face, holding a styrofoam cup of black coffee. I looked up. Sergeant First Class Reyes. 32 years of service, skin like worn leather, eyes that carried the specific weight of a man who has seen things that most people only encounter in books, crouched beside me without asking why I was on the floor of the building's exterior in the cold. He told me to drink. He said it would put the steel back in my spine. He rolled up his sleeve. A white scar ran from his elbow to his wrist. He told me it was from 2004, that he had been demoted for carrying a wounded Marine onto a medevac helicopter instead of securing a crate of ammunition. Command had called it prioritizing sentiment over assets. He looked at me steadily in the gray afternoon light. Ammo crates get replaced, he said. Human souls don't. He looked toward the administration building where Hardin sat in his temperature-controlled office. The colonel can strip your rank and bury you in a basement, Reyes said. He cannot touch your honor. You did the right thing on Route 24. Every soldier on this base knows it, including the ones who didn't say so in the mess hall. For the first time in 3 days, the weight on my chest moved. The rumor moved through the barracks before sunrise. General Caldwell was coming. Not a routine inspection visit. The Deputy Chief of Staff for Operations, a 4-star general with the specific institutional reputation of a man who had zero patience for the performance of competence in place of the real thing. His visits were not social calls. They were interrogations of a base's actual function versus its stated function, and they had ended careers before, including careers that had believed themselves secure. Fort Bragg immediately began performing. From the loading dock of Warehouse C, I watched it happen with the detached attention of someone who has been removed from the production. Soldiers on their hands and knees, scrubbing concrete sidewalks with toothbrushes, a detail spray painting dead patches of grass green so the lawn would read as vibrant from a passing motorcade window. The entire surface of the installation being polished to a standard that had nothing to do with how it actually operated 3 stories below grade. I went back to counting inventory items and assumed the storm would stay on the surface and leave the basement alone. At 1,000 hours, the concrete wall phone rang. Hardin wanted to see me. The atmosphere in his office had changed from the explosive, controlled rage of the first meeting to something colder and more deliberate. He was standing at the window, watching the frenetic preparations outside, with the expression of a man reviewing his assets. He turned. He smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the smile of someone who smells an opportunity. He told me General Caldwell would be holding a command briefing the following morning, a full report on incident rates and logistical performance. He said there was an opportunity for me. He said the word redemption. He used my first name, which he had not done in the previous meeting, and the use of it told me precisely how this was being framed in his mind. What he wanted was specific. He wanted me to stand before a 4-star general and present the events on Route 24 as a lapse in judgment, an inexperienced emotional deviation from protocol that he had identified and corrected through swift disciplinary action. I would be the example of a mistake. He would be the example of sound leadership. My act of mercy would become the decoration on his record. He wanted me to perjure myself in front of a 4-star general to service his promotion. I told him I had saved a family. I told him I would not stand before the Deputy Chief of Staff and call that a mistake. The smile disappeared. He stepped into my space and dropped his voice and told me exactly what I stood to lose. 11 years of service. 2 years from my full pension, health care, retirement security, the financial floor that I had been building since I was 22 years old and had nothing else. He told me he would see my discharge papers cite gross misconduct, that I would leave with an other than honorable notation, that I would walk out into the civilian world with nothing except a bad back and a record that closed doors before I could reach them. Be my asset for 10 minutes, he said, or be broke by Christmas. I went back to my quarters and ironed my Class A uniform. The steam rose from the dark fabric and clouded the small mirror on the wall, and the face reflected back was someone I did not immediately recognize. Not the man who had jumped into a flood ditch at 2 a.m. to pull an infant out of a sinking vehicle, but someone genuinely calculating whether a pension was worth burning that moment to the ground. I lay on the bunk in the dark and reached under the pillow. My father had been a coal miner in the Western Carolina mountains, a man with black lung and a spine that never bent to anything that asked him to be less than he was. The Bible he left me was the only object I had carried through every posting. The pages fell open naturally to Luke. I did not need to read it. I knew the passage by the shape of it. Go and do likewise. I held the Bible against my chest in the dark and listened to the rain return to Fort Bragg, counting down the hours until morning. At 0500, I was awake and sitting on the edge of my bunk with a tin of boot polish, working the toe caps in small circles until the black leather became a mirror. The ritual of the spit shine is the closest thing the military has to meditation. Small circles, water, wax, friction, repeat until the surface disappears and becomes something that reflects. Lieutenant Doyle appeared in the doorway with a travel mug and the easy manner of a man who had already decided how the day would resolve. He ran through his commentary, the apology tour, my impending departure, his plans for my vehicle, his recommendation that I return to the mountains and find something more domestically appropriate. He patted my shoulder in the condescending way of someone performing generosity for their own benefit and walked away, laughing. I watched his reflection shrink in the toe of the boot. Go and do likewise. I told myself that if I was going to lose my career in that war room, I was not going to lose my soul with it. I had done what the road required. I would say so. At 0800, the PA crackled with the announcement that General Caldwell's motorcade had passed the main gate. I adjusted my tie and walked to the mirror and looked at the man standing there in his Class A uniform. Tired eyes, hollow cheeks, creases sharp enough to cut, brass polished to a standard, and pushed open the barracks door into the North Carolina morning. The rain had stopped. The sun was cutting through the remaining clouds and hitting the wet pavement with a light that made everything shine in a way that had nothing to do with spray paint and toothbrushes. It hit my face warm and direct, and for a moment I stood in it with my eyes closed. I was the son of a coal miner who died with his lungs full of dust and his dignity intact. I was a soldier who had spent 11 years carrying other people's cargo through the dark. I was the man who had stopped on Route 24 when stopping meant everything it had cost. I squared my shoulders. I walked to the war room. The chamber was cold and windowless, dominated by a massive mahogany table with the American flag and the Army flag flanking the projection screen at its far end. General Caldwell sat at the head of the table, smaller than his portrait suggested, gray-haired, 4 silver stars on each shoulder, catching the fluorescent light with the quiet brilliance of something that doesn't need to announce itself. He was reviewing the briefing packet without looking up. The room was still. No one spoke. Hardin presented his briefing with the confidence of a man who had polished his numbers the same way the base had polished its grass, a surface designed to read as comprehensive from a distance. Efficiency metrics, maintenance cycles, disciplinary rates at historic lows. Colorful charts that I knew contained massaged figures moving across the large screen with the authority that visual presentation confers on anything, regardless of accuracy. Then Hardin shifted his tone to grave seriousness and pointed his laser at the floor near my boots and told the general he had brought me as a case study in protocol enforcement. He beckoned me forward with a sharp jerk of his head, and I walked to the end of the table and snapped to attention and stared at the wall above General Caldwell's head. Hardin described the events of October 14th on Route 24. He described my deviation from route. He described my decision as a critical error in judgment driven by inexperience. He used the phrase poor judgment twice. He explained that thanks to his swift disciplinary intervention, the situation had been contained and protocol had been restored. He said I had accepted full responsibility. Then he turned to me, and his eyes delivered the instruction as clearly as any spoken order. Say it. Confirm the narrative. Save the pension. Stand here in front of a 4-star general and call what you did a mistake. The room waited. I opened my mouth, and then General Caldwell said one word. Wait. It was not loud. It did not need to be. The single syllable stopped the room the way a hand raised on a firing range stops everything. General Caldwell closed the briefing folder. He removed his reading glasses and set them on the mahogany table with a deliberate click. He looked past Hardin, past him, as though the colonel had momentarily become transparent, and looked directly at me with gray eyes that were not angry, but searching, carrying the specific quality of a man who has learned to read the gap between what a room is performing and what is actually true. Lieutenant Marcus, he said. His voice was quiet and carried the weight of a man who has not needed volume to command a room for a very long time. Ignore the colonel's framing for a moment. I want to hear from you directly. Tell me what you did at 0200 hours on October 14th on Route 24. Hardin stepped forward. He started to speak. The general raised one hand, palm out, and Hardin stopped mid-word as though a switch had been thrown. I am asking your soldier, Colonel, Caldwell said. Not you. He looked back at me and waited. The silence in the war room was the loudest thing I had heard in 11 years of service. Hardin was staring at me from my left, his eyes wide, and delivering the threat in the clearest possible language. Say you panicked. Say it was inexperience. Say you were wrong. Save the pension. Save yourself. Give me what I need. Every officer at the table was still. The projector fan hummed. The flags at the far end of the room hung motionless. I thought about the woman curled around an infant with blue lips in 3 feet of rising floodwater. I thought about the father's face reading my name tag like a scripture. I thought about my father in the mountains, black lung and an unbent spine. I thought about Reyes's scar and the Marine he had carried, and the lesson he had offered me for the price of a cup of bad coffee. My throat had closed, but when the words finally came, they came steady. I told General Caldwell that I had stopped my vehicle, unauthorized. I told him I had seen an overturned civilian SUV in a flash flood on the shoulder of Route 24. I told him the water was rising, that there was an infant inside showing signs of hypothermia, that I had used the LMTV's tow chains to pull the vehicle to safety and transported the family to the nearest dry location. I told him it was not a mistake caused by inexperience. I told him I would make the same decision again. I locked eyes with General Caldwell and waited for what came next. What came next was not what Hardin had planned. The general did not raise his voice. He did not call for the MPS. He did not look at me with the cold, flat judgment I had been watching collect in Hardin's eyes for 3 days. He stood up slowly from his chair at the head of the table and walked around the mahogany surface, his footsteps measured and deliberate in the silent room, and stopped in front of me. He said he had 3 questions. Was the sensitive military cargo compromised in any way during the rescue operation? No, sir. The seals were intact. The load was delivered secure. Did I complete the mission and deliver the payload to the depot? Yes, sir. I arrived 45 minutes behind schedule. The delivery was completed. Was any soldier or civilian injured during the operation of the vehicle? No, sir. Everyone walked away safe. General Caldwell nodded slowly. He stood there for a long moment, long enough for the silence to become its own kind of testimony. And then he turned away from me and faced Hardin, and the calm demeanor that had characterized his presence in the room until that moment simply was not there anymore. His eyes had changed. They were blazing with a cold, controlled fire that made every officer at the table sit very still. He asked Hardin quietly whether saving 3 American lives without compromising a single piece of Army property was what the colonel had described as poor judgment. Hardin turned the color of ash. His mouth worked, but the words were slow to form. The general reached into the breast pocket of his dress uniform and produced a photograph. He set it on the mahogany table and slid it across the surface until it stopped in front of Hardin. It was a grainy print from a security camera. The parking lot of the Motel 6, my LMTV parked sideways against the rain, the small battered SUV sheltered in its shadow. He told the room he had received a phone call at 300 that morning from a man who thought he was going to die in a ditch in Cumberland County. A man who had told him that a soldier had stopped when no one else would. He pointed at the photograph. The man in that car, he said, is my son-in-law. The woman holding the infant is my daughter. The blue-lipped baby that my soldier was too emotionally compromised to abandon in a rising flood. That is my only grandchild. The silence that followed was absolute. Hardin looked at the photograph. He looked at the general. He looked at me. The realization moved across his face in sequence. Not recognition of what he had done wrong, but the dawning understanding of what he had done it to, and to whom, and in front of what audience. His hands were shaking. The silver laser pointer he had been carrying throughout his presentation slipped from between his fingers and clattered across the polished floor. General Caldwell turned his back on Hardin and returned to where I was standing. The four-star authority was still present, but something had changed in his face. The steel had softened into something more personal and less containable. He told me that his son-in-law had told them they had seen my name tag, that I had told him his only mission was to keep the baby warm. He placed a hand on my shoulder, not a formal gesture, not a military acknowledgement, but the grip of a grandfather who has just been told that his grandchild is alive because of the person standing in front of him. He said I had not broken the rules. He said I had rewritten the rule on humanity that my commander had apparently forgotten. He said that the Army's mission was to protect, and that I had been the only person in the building that morning who had understood that mission correctly. The tears came before I could stop them. I was standing at the position of attention in the war room of Fort Bragg in front of the Deputy Chief of Staff of the Army, and my shoulders were shaking. 11 years of service, 3 days of basement inventory, Doyle's shoulder in the mess hall, my mother's relieved exhale on the payphone, Reyes's scar and his cup of bad coffee, the blue-lipped infant and the father's face reading my name tag like a prayer. All of it arrived at once. I was not a failure. I was not a disgrace. I was a soldier. And I had done what soldiers are for. The silence after Hardin's laser pointer hit the floor did not last long. The colonel attempted to recover. He stammered through an explanation. He had not known, obviously. If he had known the general's family was involved, he would have authorized the stop himself. He would have sent an escort. There had been a miscommunication in the chain of... General Caldwell silenced him with a single raised hand. And then he said the thing that mattered more than any of the rest of it. He told Hardin that precisely was the problem. If he had known it was the general's family, Hardin would have pinned a medal on my chest himself. He would have rolled out every available resource. But because he believed the family in the ditch was anonymous, just civilians, just nobody dying in the rain, he had spent 3 days trying to destroy the soldier who had saved them. A soldier's integrity, Caldwell said, is not measured by who they save. It is measured by who they are. I had not stopped because I wanted a reward. I hadn't checked the rank or the last name of the people in that ditch. I had stopped because it was what soldiers do. We protect. He gestured toward the window, toward the base visible outside. The spray-painted grass, the soldiers with toothbrushes on the sidewalks, the entire performance of excellence that Hardin had been orchestrating for the morning's arrival. He told Hardin he had seen the base. He told him a commander who spent his energy polishing the surface until it gleamed while the core rotted had built a unit based on fear rather than trust, had turned capable soldiers into machines terrified to exercise moral judgment because the cost of a wrong answer was their career. He told Hardin he had nearly destroyed the only officer on the installation who still had a functioning moral compass. Then he picked up the general officer memorandum of reprimand from the table, the document I had signed in Hardin's office, with a hand that shook so badly the signature looked like a wound. He held it up for the room to see. He tore it in half. He tore the halves again. He walked to the corner of the room and let the pieces fall into the trash can, and the sound they made settling into the bin was the quietest sound I had ever heard accomplish so much. "Colonel Hardin," General Caldwell said, his voice returning to the register of official finality, "you are relieved of your command, effective immediately. You have 1 hour to clear your desk." Hardin looked up. His face had gone the particular gray of someone who has just watched the floor disappear. He asked where he would go. Caldwell told him he had the perfect assignment for a man who loved paperwork and procedure. A transfer to the Records Archive Division at the Pentagon, basement level. No windows, miles of files, and dust. He could count paper clips to his heart's content, and at least down there, he couldn't hurt anyone else. It was the exact punishment Hardin had tried to use against me, The basement, the meaningless counting, the silence designed to wear a person down. He would spend what remained of his career in the same category of isolation he had tried to make permanent for me, buried under the weight of his own institutional love of paperwork. Hardin did not salute. He turned and walked out of the war room like a man who has suddenly become much older than he was when he walked in, his footsteps dragging on the polished floor. As he passed the table of staff officers, not one of them looked at him. He was a ghost walking out of his own career. When the heavy door closed behind him, something happened to the atmosphere in the room. The officers who had been watching me with varying degrees of contempt and indifference when I had walked in were looking at me with something I had not seen directed at me since before the reprimand. Not warmth, respect. The cautious, genuine kind that comes from watching someone hold the truth under significant pressure. Across the room, Lieutenant Doyle was staring at his boots. His face was flushed red, and he could not meet my eyes. I had not sought revenge against him. I had not shouted or responded to his public mockery in the mess hall. I had stood on the truth and let the truth do its work, and the work had been done more thoroughly than anything I could have engineered. After the officers filed out of the war room, General Caldwell signaled me to stay. The room was quiet in a way that had not been true 30 minutes earlier, cleaned of the suffocating tension that had occupied it, and left with something lighter. The general did not return to the head of the table. He walked over to where I was standing and pulled a smartphone from his pocket. His hands, which had just efficiently ended a colonel's command with the calm precision of a man who had done harder things, were gentle with the screen. He wanted to show me something. He turned the phone toward me. It was a video, shaky and vertical, shot in a warm living room somewhere in the Carolina foothills. A small girl with curly blonde hair was bouncing on a beige sofa, clutching a worn stuffed bear, her cheeks pink and full with the health of a child who has no idea what the word hypothermia means. A woman's voice from behind the camera encouraged her to wave and say hi, and the girl waved at the lens with both hands and announced a thank you to the fire truck man for the ride. I let out a wet, unsteady laugh. General Caldwell smiled beside me and wiped a corner of his eye with one knuckle. He told me that, to a 3-year-old, the LMTV had looked exactly like a fire truck. She did not know ranks or regulations. She just knew that someone had come when no one else did. He told me the little girl would grow up and have a life and a future because of what I had done on Route 24. He said he owed me a debt he would never be able to repay. Then he addressed me as Major, and when I corrected him, I was a lieutenant. He smiled and told me I would not be for long. 1 week later, the sun blazed over the parade field at Fort Bragg with the specific brilliance of a Carolina morning that has been washed clean by recent storms. The entire transport battalion was assembled in formation, camouflage standing at attention in long, clean rows in the heat. This was not a punishment detail. This was a ceremony. The PA system called attention to orders. I marched out to the center of the field with my boots crunching on the gravel and took my position in front of General Caldwell, who was flanked by the American flag and the battalion colors moving in the morning breeze. The Army does not typically skip ranks. The progression from lieutenant to captain to major is the standard path, earned one painful rung at a time. But today, the Army was making an exception. General Caldwell removed the silver bar of a first lieutenant from my collar. In its place, he pinned a gold oak leaf. I had skipped an entire rank, moving from junior officer to field-grade commander in a single ceremony, publicly and permanently. He leaned close as he adjusted the collar and told me quietly that he did not want another Hardin running the transport division. He wanted someone who understood that people mattered more than paperwork. He wanted my conscience to lead the battalion. Before dismissing the formation, the general announced a new standing order, effective immediately across all Army commands. It was officially designated Regulation 19C, but everyone on base was already calling it by the name that had attached itself naturally to the thing it described: the Samaritan Rule. Any military personnel operating a government vehicle were authorized to deviate from their designated route and utilize government assets to provide emergency assistance to civilians in life-threatening distress without fear of administrative reprisal. My name was not in the document, but as General Caldwell read it aloud in the North Carolina morning, I felt a warmth in my chest that had nothing to do with the sun. The impossible choice I had faced on Route 24, career or conscience, pension or a child's life, was a choice that no other soldier would ever be forced to make in the same way again. Kindness had been written into law. The road I had taken alone in the rain had become a road that others could now take without fear. As the formation broke and soldiers came forward to shake my hand, Lieutenant Doyle appeared at the edge of the crowd. The smug authority was gone from his face, replaced by the specific discomfort of someone who has watched their assumptions be publicly dismantled and is not sure what to do with the space that leaves. He held his cover in his hands and stumbled through an apology. The mess hall, the barracks, the comments about finding something more suitable. He looked at his boots. He said he had been wrong. I looked at him and thought about what Sergeant Reyes had said about human souls not being replaceable. I thought about what it would mean to use my new rank to return Doyle's contempt with the power to enforce consequences. I thought about Hardin counting dust in a Pentagon basement, and whether that was the model of justice I wanted to operate by. I extended my hand. I told him it was forgotten. I told him the only advice I could offer was this: never laugh at someone trying to do the right thing, because you never know when you might need a Samaritan yourself. He took my hand. For the first time, the salute he gave me when he turned to walk away was genuine. 1 year passed, the way years pass, after a storm has done its worst and left the landscape rearranged. The dogwood trees outside the administration building at Fort Bragg were shedding their leaves in the October light, painting the sidewalks in colors that had nothing apologetic about them. I was sitting behind the mahogany desk in the office that had belonged to Hardin. The same desk, the same room, the same chair. But the room felt completely different. Under Hardin, the office had been a sealed fortress. Blinds drawn, air conditioning at 68 degrees, the expensive coffee machine in the corner, the door always closed. Soldiers had stood at rigid attention in the doorway because coming into this room had meant either a specific assignment or a specific problem, and neither category was comfortable. Now the windows were cracked to let in the October air and the distant sound of engines from the motor pool. The espresso machine was gone, replaced by a standard-issue drip maker that gurgled in the corner and was always full. The door was open. Soldiers came in to talk, to plan, to raise issues they did not have to frame as emergencies first. Sometimes they came in just to sit for a few minutes in a room where no one was performing anything. My unit had acquired a name around the base, the Samaritan Squad, unofficial, unwritten in any doctrine, but consistent in the way that earned reputations are consistent. In the 12 months since Regulation 19C had been announced, the drivers of my transport battalion had stopped to assist in more than 50 roadside emergencies along the back roads of the Carolina foothills and the stretch of I-95 that ran through Cumberland County. Cars pulled from ditches, tires changed for stranded civilians on their way to somewhere urgent. First aid provided at accident scenes while paramedics were still in transit. We had proven, in the most practical and undramatic way possible, that a military unit could deliver its cargo on time and still stop when the road required it. I shifted in the chair and picked up the plain white envelope that had arrived in the morning mail. No military rank on the return address, just a name and a P.O. box in Central Virginia. Former Colonel Hardin had retired 6 months earlier quietly, after completing his assignment in the Pentagon's records archive. The handwriting on the letter was familiar, but changed. Less aggressive, the pen pressure lighter than the sharp, authoritative signature I remembered on the reprimand document he had tossed across the desk at me. He was volunteering at a Red Cross distribution center in Virginia. He described his days as a worker, moving supply crates for disaster relief. The backaches, the physical toll, the specific humility of manual labor approached without rank or title to protect you from the fact of it. Then came the lines that made me set the letter down for a moment. He wrote that for the first time in 20 years he was sleeping through the night. He wrote that the warehouse work was honest, in a way that his last years in command hadn't been. He wrote that he had spent a long time trying to understand the difference between the authority he had worn on his shoulders and the authority he had actually earned, and that he was starting to understand why those two things had not been the same thing for a very long time. He thanked me for the hardest lesson of his career. He said honor was not something you wore on a uniform. He said it was something you carried in your chest, and that you could lose it without noticing, and that you could find it again in unexpected places, including in the example of a soldier you had tried to destroy. He asked for forgiveness. I folded the letter and placed it in the drawer. There was no bitterness left in me about any of it. Not about the basement inventory or the reprimand or the morning in the war room or Doyle's shoulder in the mess hall. What had replaced the bitterness was something quieter and more durable. The specific piece of a person who made a difficult decision correctly and has lived with the consequences and found them livable. Forgiveness, I had learned, is not something you offer for the benefit of the other person. It is something you give yourself to stop paying the ongoing cost of carrying the weight of someone else's choices. I hoped Hardin found his way back to something honest. The crates he was moving were heavier than anything he had handled in his climate-controlled office, and that seemed exactly right. I looked at the one decoration on my desk, not a medal or a plaque or a certificate. A cheap black plastic frame holding a grainy security camera print. The parking lot of the Motel 6 on a stormy October night. My LMTV parked sideways across the frame with its lights on, and behind it, sheltered from the rain, the small, fragile shape of the civilian SUV. General Caldwell had sent it to me the week after the ceremony, with a note written in neat cursive on the back. For the days when the storms return, so you never forget what real courage looks like. I turned the frame over in my hands. To anyone else, it was just a blurry image of a traffic situation in bad weather. To me, it was the most honest photograph I owned. The biggest machine in my care, parked between a storm and a family that did not know my name, doing what it was built to do. Outside, the October sky was darkening. Gray clouds were rolling in over the installation from the west, and the first drops of the new rain began to hit the window pane in a scattered rhythm that would thicken into something serious by nightfall. Another Virginia storm coming up through the Carolinas. Another night of wet asphalt on the back roads of Cumberland County. I stood up and walked to the window and looked down at the motor pool. A convoy of 20 LMTVs was lined up with their headlights already on, engines running, ready to move supplies to the coast ahead of the weather. I could see the drivers in their cabs, young faces under helmets, hands on wheels, waiting for the word. I picked up the radio handset from my desk. "Attention all Samaritan stations," I said into the mic. "This is Samaritan 6. We have heavy weather coming in. Roads will be wet, and visibility will drop. Your mission is to get the payload to the destination on schedule." I looked at the photograph one last time. But remember your standing orders. Keep your eyes open. If you see someone in trouble, you stop. We do not leave anyone behind in the dark. Watch your 6 and drive safe. Samaritan 6, out. I hung up the handset and watched the convoy begin to roll out through the gate. Big wheels turning through the new rain, headlights cutting through the early dark of the Carolina evening. The storm was building behind them, loud and real, just like the one a year ago. But this time, none of those drivers would have to make the choice I had made alone on Route 24. This time, the rule said stop. This time, the road was theirs to travel honestly. The truest test of character is not what you do when the sun is shining and the general is watching. It is what you do when the only witness is your own conscience. And the cost is everything you have spent years building. We are all driving heavy vehicles through the dark, toward deadlines and paychecks and the comfortable routines of lives we have constructed. It is always easier to keep driving. But a machine without a human heart behind the wheel is just weight and noise moving through the dark. Stop when the road requires it. The pension is not worth more than the person in the ditch. The rule book is not worth more than the life the rule book is supposed to protect. I turned from the window and walked back to my desk. I had a battalion to run, and for the first time in 11 years, I felt exactly like I was where I belonged.